Edition podcast by Enolla Consulting.
Kevin, hello.
Hi.
I'm feeling very spoiled today. I've got you for us, our special edition for our Inclusion Week. So I'm absolutely thrilled. And I'm just excited for our audience to meet Kevin Yusuf Coleman. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who you are so people get a flow for that. And then we'll just get in and have a conversation, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me.
No, not at all. I'm sure that I'll be the one getting to the thanks for inviting you once the people should watch the show. So Kevin, you're head of EDI at BBC Studios, which is an interesting job, one of our clients, and we'll talk more about that. But your strategic work around this whole thing, you've done some fascinating work, not least of which the kind of groundbreaking work you did at Brentford Football Club, which I know when you and I first met, we were talking quite a lot about that, and I was intrigued by your work at Brentford. You've also worked for Kick It Out, I think, so
Yeah.
a whole story about the working in the race space, which is really interesting. And of course, you're now very much involved in driving the work at BBC Studios, which is the commercial arm, essentially, of the BBC Corporation.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting kind of join up that I'm going to come back to you in a minute about the world of media and the world of sport. I'm intrigued about both those things because obviously if you've thought about two things that are at the top of people's minds, they may well be right up there. But I'd like to start somewhere else if I can.
Okay.
So when we have our guests on the show, we're always interested in people's inclusion story. And when we're working with clients, as you'll know, the first thing we ask in a workshop is, what's your why? And what we normally discover is that when people come to these conversations, it's because they have a very strong why. Why does inclusion matter to Kevin Yusuf Coleman?
I think it's a good question. I think it's something you often get asked. And sometimes I sit down myself and think about why. There is I think there's a couple of reasons. I don't think it's a sort of a binary answer. I think there's some of the usual cliches. You know, I grew up in a very diverse area. I went to school with really different people, whether it's ethnically, different faiths. I played a lot of sports, so I came across a lot of very different people. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'd naturally work in D&I. I married someone of a different race and faith. We have mixed heritage children. So my life has been a sort of a very curved path. But I think the one thing that's really stuck in my mind is a sort of notion of fairness. And I think that's, for me, inclusion is the bigger part of D&I. Diversity is really important, but without the inclusion, you lose the impact. And I think that sense of fairness and everyone being given the same opportunity and the same chance to be successful or happy or just lead a normal life, I think that's sort of at the core of everything I've ever been involved in. So my passion was sport. I went to university and studied business, but I was always either playing or involved in sport in some way. And I got my first role at the LTA, Lawn Tennis Association. And towards the end of my time there, I started working on the equality standard for sport, which is the certification all governing bodies have to ascribe to. And that's where my sort of first interest really lay. And I got involved in that one. That was really, I started to understand how things that seem very equal and universal are often not. And then my next role quite soon after was at Kick It Out, which is a lot more about stopping discrimination and then hopefully leading to inclusion. And that was very, very much about fairness. I think sometimes when you're in bigger organizations, you can look at it from a more strategic and corporate lens, and you can be a little bit more at arm's length. But I think the way I came into the business, it was very much about that notion of fairness was almost the magnet that pulled me in.
It's really interesting. There's just a broad range of subjects as well. What would fairness, do you think, look like for you? And particularly, and maybe fairness, maybe I can ask this from any number of views. So on the one hand, from a professional view, when you look at the workplace, it might be, for example, you're looking at representation within tennis, which is a pretty elite sport, right? Or you might be looking at representation and equality and equity within football, or you might be thinking about it from your children's perspective, being the I don't know how you identify your children, whether you call them biracial or mixed race. I'm not sure what language you would use, but what does fairness look like, do you think?
I think that's quite a big question. I think it's when it boils down to it, it's everyone sort of having a level playing field. So I think that's why going back to sport is quite a constant theme, because whenever you play a game of tennis or you play a game of football, everything starts from that level playing field. And, you know, everything that happens is I often reflect on playing. I might play tennis with someone who is very successful, who I would never even, you know, have a meeting with in normal business day. But on the tennis court, once we start, it's just me and that person. And it's down to your merit and your skills and your tenacity and your focus. So everything comes down to a level playing field. I think the same socially. You know, once you start to travel and you go around the world, you realise how privileged, being born in a country like just being born in the UK, you are probably within the top 1 or 2% of privileged people on the planet. You know, there are people who are born in other parts of the world who may have much more skill and knowledge and morals and work ethic than I, but just because of where they're born are going to have a constant uphill battle no matter what they do. And that again goes back to that sense of fairness and unfairness. And you realise, I think when you're in privileged position, unfairness is something you don't really think about. You think the world, you know, that everything is based on merit. But actually you realise how unfair the majority of the world is.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at the world from a position of privilege, it's easy for you to think it's a meritocracy, isn't it? When the reality is, if you're standing the other side of that equation, then you realise it's actually a meritocracy, not a meritocracy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting how people that look like you, whoever that you might be, is tends to be the one that enjoys that. I think that's a really interesting thing to say, and I like your distinction, because I think it's an important call out when you said the idea of a level playing field. And it's ironic, isn't it, that we've kind of have a lot of government noise around the idea of, you know, leveling up and the big society and all the rest of it in the last 15 years or so. But I think there's something really important about that level playing field point, because I think for a lot of people, and I don't know whether you would recognize this, Kevin, but I think a lot of people, when they hear the conversation, particularly there's something almost sort of triggering for people when they hear the language of diversity and inclusion. So sometimes I think what they hear, particularly when they hear the word diversity, is the first instinct is to think you mean some of them. So these are other people who are not us, obviously, whoever the us is. And the idea then is somehow that whatever initiative you're going to be proposing to me is not about leveling the playing field. It's about lowering the bar.
Yeah.
So what the sense is that we have to drop the standard to accommodate these other people, to make it fair for these other people. And what's so frustrating is, as one of those other people, I'm going, I have no interest in you lowering the bar. I just want you to level the field.
Yeah, 100%.
Right, and that's all there is to it. Do you see that? Is that sentiment still something that is abroad in terms of, I don't know, whether it's at the BBC or whether it's in sport? Do you see that that notion that there is still something of a sentiment that people think that the diversity higher is kind of less than?
Yeah, I think that's why I think if we speak about inclusion rather than diversity, that's the key.
I completely agree.
Talk about inclusion, and I think comms is really, people don't understand how important communication is, especially around D&I. I think you could have a fantastic initiative which does everything that you need, and if you communicate it badly, it can go completely pear-shaped. And sometimes you have initiatives which are a little bit simplistic and are not ideal, but are communicated really well, and they'll be supported universally.
Absolutely.
So I think the D&I agenda has been communicated in such a random way that you're right. Sometimes you talk about D&I training is a classic. You know, I think just saying that phrase will often put a lot of people off. And people think the D&I agenda, you're right, is just for minority groups. But actually, if you think about it, it's probably as much, if not more, for people who are in the majority. You know, it's whatever the majority group is, they're the people who have created the environment for there to be this inequality. They're the people that are more likely to be able to make the decisions to make it a level playing field. If people are oppressed or excluded, you can't really expect them to create the solutions to make it a level playing field, because they would have done it in the first place.
They don't have the power to
That's
begin
right.
with.
It's about everybody.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's good that you're making that distinction because this is Inclusion Week, right? So this is an important thing to say. And I think that there's a kind of bit of a, I don't know, we don't see this as much, but we certainly used to see it in the early days, that people used to use the words diversity and inclusion as though they were interchangeable words, right? And you go,
completely different
one
thing.
says diversity,
Yeah.
the other one says inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think that idea for me is interesting because, again, you'll know this through the work we've done with you at Studios, but also you'll know this from your own understanding and teaching around it. The idea is saying that when we're talking about diversity, not only do we now think we mean somebody else, we mean others, but we also miss the point that diversity is not limited to, I don't know, 9 protected characteristics. Every single human being on the earth is unique.
Yeah.
Right? So if you've got 8 billion people on the earth, you must therefore have something like 8 billion permutations of diversity. But we get very lazy, don't we? So we say black people, gender, whatever else we might have, what we like to box them up in. So we would say, and I know you would recognize this, that diversity is a fact, right? It's about your...
Yes.
It's just a fact, right? It's about your individual collection of social identities that make us who we are. And inclusion, that's a feeling. And inclusion is about, and its opposite, exclusion, how I'm made to feel about the difference and the social identities that make me who I am, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think, diversity and inclusion is such an important part of society. It's become, especially in the UK, I think, such a key talking point, something that touches on everything we do. I think if I could change one thing, I would put it on the curriculum. That in the same way that kids do PGCE, or they study everything. They study geography. They might study things that they never use again in their lifetime. If they just understood the basic premise of diversity being how every one of us is different. If you asked anyone if they were exactly the same as their friend, who you both might be, 14-year-old white boys, they'd say, of course not. So you're diverse. If people get that concept, and they get the concept that inclusion means feeling included. In the same way you can't define inclusion explicitly, you can't define happiness or sadness, because it's just how you personally feel. If everyone got those two concepts, in a way that I think younger people today, because they're a lot more comfortable with the subject, seem to naturally embrace a lot of conversations around D&I in a way that my generation or generations before don't, then we'd sort of be halfway there.
It's a great point, actually, because it does begin. I think we have to think about the system itself, right? But indeed, those of us that are going into that system, it starts really early, doesn't it? And that education process is powerful because you almost have to be taught exclusion at one level, which is fascinating. So I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by that because I think that notion of saying that that we are all individuals and that you say 2 white boys are not the same. There's a kind of build on that, right? So I often think to myself, we've got 4 children, right? And we have 4 grandchildren. Now, the fact of the matter is, when I think about the children or the grandchildren, they are as closely related as is humanly possible to be. They're siblings. But do we treat them all the same? No, we love them all the same, but we treat them differently. Why? Because they're different, right? Exactly. And each of them has a unique way of thinking about stuff. And I think that what that then raises for me is a really interesting discussion around saying the problem with the lazy version of equality is equality brings you to a place where you think about same treatment.
Yeah.
But equity is about treating people equally well.
Yeah.
And that means a kind of hyper-personalization in the way that we work with people. I'm thinking about sport, for example. Let's take you've worked at the high elite end of sports. So you think about when you're working with a Premiership football club, and actually Brentford's a good example because Thomas Frank would have been the manager with you when you were there?
Yep.
And I don't know him, but he seems to me somebody that understands the fact that his squad of 25 players isn't a kind of homogenous whole. There are 25 individual humans.
Exactly. And it's interesting, sport, because you're right. The whole notion of sport is that everyone plays by the same rules. So that is exactly the explanation of equality. But at the same time, a manager would know there are 11 different positions and you have to have 11 different people. So it just within the same situation, you've got both of those concepts working
But
together.
they work, don't they?
Yeah, it works.
Why do they work? Oh, no, you're the expert. I'm guessing. But do they work because the individuals see themselves as part of the whole, and therefore, because I kind of think this. So let me run this for you and tell me if this is rubbish or not. But one of the things I've been interested in when I think about organisations, I say, okay, one of the key criteria we have to set up in an organisation, and sport, by the way, is a very interesting example because there's a lot of jeopardy in sport. Because, for example, if I'm, I don't know, Ivan Toney or whoever it might be at Brentford, and I'm not playing well, there is somebody waiting to come on and take my place, right? So it's a very competitive environment. But nonetheless, the thing I'm thinking about is that if I can set up an environment where people enjoy what we would call inclusion safety, that sense of inclusion safety makes me feel as though I can be part of this collective we call the whole. So I have this sense of psychological safety. There are all sorts of I feel psychologically safe with this group of people. I feel a sense of connection with this group of people, and I feel we're trying to build something for a shared future. If, on the other hand, I feel I don't enjoy inclusion safety in this community, then I might feel I can only show up in part in this whole, because I'm not necessarily sure that my brand of being me is going to be valuable. And I look at organizations and I think there's these two polarized positions. Some people feel as though they can be part of the whole. Other people feel apart from the whole. But then there's this huge band in the middle that feel they can only be a part of who they are in this whole.
It's almost the anxious middle.
Yeah, they're anxious, beautifully put. And I'm wondering, does somebody, and he seems very skillful, does somebody like Thomas Frank create the sort of environment where one feels part of the whole? Doesn't matter whether you're the ticket person or wherever.
It's almost the definition of basically teamwork, family, community. You hear it a lot, I think, said around football, but I think it really has meaning there. And I think when you explained that, it reminded me of the difference between club and international football. So in club football, you're all there, you're all on a contract, which gives you that security. There's a sense of community that you're playing for each other for a bigger objective. You've still got the rules and regulations you have to play by. And that's the equality bit. That's all about compliance. That's what you have to do. And to get people to want to work together. And then you look at the England team, and you can almost explain why they don't perform so well, because they don't have that understanding, they don't have that teamwork, they don't have that collaboration. They're a group of individuals who are brilliant as individuals, but who are thrown together for a handful of days.
Wow,
and I think that's why, on paper, the England team, and similarly the Dutch team, these teams of amazing individuals who never quite achieve, but the teams like Germany, who don't have the star players, but have that mindset of playing for their country, where it probably means slightly more compared to the UK, where you've got the most successful league in the Premier League, where that's everyone's priority. And you can see that dynamic playing out in real life.
That is really interesting. Talk to me a little bit more about the connection you see between football or sport more generally and media, because you've worked in both. So what do you see as a practitioner in that?
But what was interesting, I think, because I worked in sport for 20 years, and I saw really the power of sport. The power of where sport can do things naturally that other interventions can't. And I felt like, I guess because I love sport so much, it was really a busman's holiday. I didn't feel like I'd ever really worked. Everyone says if you do a job you like, you never work a day in your life.
If I was watching football all day, I'd be super happy. There'd be no problem with that.
And I felt like actually I've never had a proper job. I've never actually worked because I'm just doing stuff that's really fun. So I sort of took the plunge, and I think somewhere like the BBC, it felt like a step up, because it feels like an organisation from the outside that where diversity and inclusion are sort of baked in. It feels like it's part of the perception or the expectation when you walk in the door. And D&I wise, the real surprise was that the diversity and inclusion part is sort of exactly the same. I realised that wherever you go, you talk about diversity, you look at how different people are in a sort of superficial way, you know, the protected characteristics, and you try and ask people how included they feel, and you try and fix the processes and the policies which might hold some of that back. And I realised that that was exactly the same. You know, the diversity and inclusion theory part was the same. But what was really, really different wasn't even the industries, it's the organisation.
Ah.
So that is the key to successful D&I is nothing to do with D&I. I think most people who work in it get, and it's relatively simplistic, you know, concepts. But how you try and deliver that in an organisation. So one of the biggest factors is it's simply the size of the organisation. So at Brentford, there were 200 people. I pretty much knew every single person by name. So inclusion was a lot easier to try and implement, to have a sense of teamwork and belonging. Whereas in BBC Studios, even though the type of people they attract to work there are more naturally supportive of the D&I agenda, the fact is I'll maybe only meet 10% of them ever. So the real difficulty is trying to get those concepts and initiatives across a group of people you'll never meet who work in very different areas. So what might work in production on a set will be very different to finance, will be very different to marketing, will be very different to global sales. So each division within the organisation is almost like a separate company, and you have to deliver diversity and inclusion in a different way in each area. And, you know, some of those areas like IT, tech are going to be dictated, their diversity is going to be partly dictated by the IT and tech industry, you know, because that's where those people are recruited from. So it actually gets really, really complex and difficult to get an aligned common sense of understanding of what you're trying to work towards. That's why marketing and comms, going back to that point, is so important. If you're a really good people person, you can understand how to converse with different people at different levels, and you've got key messages that you're really good at getting across. That's probably more important, I think, than actually knowledge of diversity and inclusion.
It's really interesting. So much of it is cultural, isn't it, as well? You know, you think to yourself, I can't help but think to myself, diversity and inclusion is very simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
not easy.
very, as I say, very situation specific. I've realised there are very few organisations that are actually good at it. I think people will see a very simplistic version of any company, and they'll see the one or two projects that they do, but you lift up the bonnet and you see that there are issues everywhere. And I think that's just part of the agenda, because I think in D&I you never really achieve success, because you'll be spinning lots of plates, and when you achieve one target, by the time you've got there, the world has moved on. You know, I think the real mark of success of diversity and inclusion is society. It's almost, are you ahead or behind society? So in football, for example, there are some things that football does really well where they're ahead of society and they're pulling society with them. And in that respect, they're successful. In some areas, say fan behaviour on the terraces, they're probably behind, because people do things culturally in stadiums that they'd never do in the workplace. And I think that's really the only marker of success, whether you're slightly ahead or slightly behind society.
That's such an interesting thing to say, actually. That's a really interesting thing, because I was thinking about actually how the industries that you've worked in, I mean, you couldn't pick. The only thing I think of you could take as your next role, if you decide to leave studios, which I hope you don't, is maybe fashion or something. But you've taken such influence, organisations and areas that influence. I mean, the influence of sport is just extraordinary.
And that, funnily enough, that's what matters to people. I think people in D&I, as I say, we're going back to that concept of fairness, are driven slightly differently. Money means, you know, different things to different people. You've got to be able to pay the mortgage and buy lunch. But I think people are driven by change. So, you know, coming to somewhere, I worked for nearly 10 years at the FA, and that having an impact on the policy and the way football's delivered across the country had real meaning. So it's only coming to somewhere like BBC where the content we create has an impact on, you know, perceptions of things around the world. especially the impartiality and the news the BBC group produces has real meaning. And I think that's the thing that drives us, the ability to have some sort of impact or change the world, even if it's 0.0001%.
But it's incredible. I mean, I have the privilege of working with the senior teams at BBC Studios and, of course, the corporation as well. And I always think to myself when I was with the group just yesterday, and I'm sitting thinking to myself, these folks have the ability, the influence they have. If there's something we can do to awaken their consciousness to this conversation around inclusion, this idea about because it's like I got an alchemic power when you understand it, right? That you wake people up to that. I mean, it's just such an amazing privilege, and it thrills me. We feel very privileged to work with you and some of the other big organisations we work with. But interesting, I'm still caught on the idea of thinking about your sports versus industry type of analogy. And I think one of the things I think is very interesting to me is that if I think about sport, and tennis is an interesting example because it's so singular, or maybe you might be doubles, but it's a singular sport. Football is fascinating, right? But the thing about that is that if I'm a manager of a football team, for example, now there's going to be some problems with this because it kind of all goes up to the top. So this is not going to quite work as an illustration, but I think you'll follow me some of the way at least. What it looks like is in corporate life, we tend to look at our 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, 200,000, whatever number of employees. And we think we have a department in our organizations called HR. And in that HR department, we're thinking about humans as resources. And then we're thinking, how many of these resources do I need? Do I need more? Do I need less? And we call it workforce planning, all the rest of it. And I get all that. I understand the strategic reason for that. But at its soul, there's something problematic about that. Because in its soul, it seems to me we're saying, how do we use these disposable humans as resources for our balance sheet?
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm managing a football team and I've got 11 people, I have to think to myself, how do I resource these humans? What are the resources I've got to wrap around these humans to get optimum performance? And it feels to me like the inclusion conversation feels like saying, what is it we have to do, Kevin, with your 5,500 people, whether they're in IT, whether they're in production, whether they're wherever they are in media, whatever they're doing? What do we have to do to resource those humans, to make those humans feel valued, to feel respected, to feel trusted, to feel safe, to feel like they belong, to feel like they can really be their best selves and do their best work? And that to me seems the ultimate performance-based conversation, but it's about resourcing human beings, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, because from an organizational point of view, you're right. You're from that standpoint, you're thinking about the organization and the profit. Bottom line is profit, and people are secondary. Whereas when you're a manager, your parameters are already set. You have those people, and actually you're trying to get the best out of those people. It's been well researched that humans never quite fulfill their potential. Einstein talked about how much brain capacity we have. There are so many different things that people can achieve. And also if they do achieve them, they play a bigger part and contribute more to society. You're right. So it goes back to those individuals, how we include them so they can do their best work. So that's why we always talk about people being their authentic self, people coming into work, not worrying about all of the kerfuffle, all of the noise, the competition between people, what grades people are, about policies and processes. If they forget about all that, they just be themselves, and all of those unique skills and experiences, all that comes into their work, then they'll be the best they can be. Then the organisation will be more impactful.
Everybody wins. I like this notion you're going to pick up, if I may, about this authentic self piece. I wanted to talk about that. Are you happy for us to have a conversation about what makes you, your backstory as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, sure.
Because I mean, I introduced you as Kevin Yusuf Coleman, right? And I'm aware of, and I've been witness to, and been very impressed with a lot of the work you've done around Asian voices within the BBC, and you do some really interesting stuff around that. And I want to talk about that because I'm interested in firstly the conversation around spirituality and religion in the workplace. I think that's a kind of huge area. That's an area where you get asked to be involved in more and more and more. But you have a very interesting perspective. You come from this as a white man, and in every demographic test, it seems that the white middle class middle aged man seems to be the Asbro problem in the room, which is like we really need to get past that. But could you talk to me a little bit about that? So, what's your experience? Because you said you married into a lady of another faith.
Yeah.
You've embraced that faith.
Yes.
So let me ask: has that faith embraced you?
Yes. So
It's
interesting actually. So going back to your point about white men, and I think white Western non-disabled men are sort of this concept, and I always go back to it, which I think people quite like it because it refers back to food, but it's the lasagna of privilege. So we are all in this lasagna of privilege. You know, if you look at yourself in the dynamic of the UK, you might be slightly less or more privileged than people. You look at other countries which are in the developing countries, which are a lot poorer and have a lot more issues. So being a man, generally speaking, in the world gives you more privileged. Being non-disabled gives you more privileged. Being heterosexual can give you more privilege. So every aspect of diversity you look at, you sort of shift up or down in this lasagna. And white, middle class, middle-aged Western men are sort of very near the sort of bechamel sauce at the top of this lasagna of privilege. That's why when we talk about to football, I remember talking to professional black footballers who, within the context of football, received a lot of discrimination and racism and were excluded. But within the lasagna of privilege, they're still pretty near the top and need to recognise that fact because you're a professional sportsman, very good chance you're a millionaire. But my backstory, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned that. So I was born a very typical white English London bloke to a family that is nominally Christian but not practicing. My mother's Irish. She was more practicing. I went to Sunday school. But I grew up, as I say, in a very diverse area. I had lots of mixed friends. And I met my now wife when we were relatively young. And I think I've always liked to think of someone who is of principle. And I saw lots of people who married and converted for convenience. And I decided early on I wasn't going to do that. And I studied Islam. I went to a place called the Muslim College. And after a while realized that actually what Islam teaches is what I already believed. So all the same principles and all the things and all the messages that it taught were what I'd already thought, but it just had a different label. We talk about charity, and in Islam, you give charity. It's part of you're actually compelled to do it, and it tells you exactly how to work it out. It talks about loving your neighbor. It talks about generally being a good person, all the things you should focus on in life. I already thought those things, but it gave me a bit of a framework. So it gave me, I think I'm probably naturally slightly lazy. So something that's a bit more prescriptive, where I know what I should be doing and shouldn't, really, really worked. And actually people were really, really welcoming, more so than we ever thought. So it's actually been a very, very positive journey. But it's interesting, and it reminds me of within your training, the inclusive leadership workshop, talking about people being others.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I've noticed about myself is that I am sort of someone who doesn't really sit in any circle or in any category. So I don't drink. Most people I know do. I'm vegetarian. Most people I know aren't. I'm Muslim. And most people I know aren't. So in most situations,
You're right.
I've sort of got one foot, I'll be in a footballing environment with lots of other white men. So I'm sort of I've got my foot in that circle, but I don't drink and I'm Muslim and I'm vegetarian, which is actually quite an unusual mix. So I've almost got my foot where whatever situation I'm in, one foot in, one foot out. I'm a trustee of a Muslim women's sports charity. I'm the only man in the room often. I'm the only white person in the room. So but I'm Muslim. So we have lots in common, but quite a lot we don't have in common. So it's very rare I'm ever in any situation where I'm completely part of the group, but also hardly ever not part of the group,
So
which probably
interesting.
gives me a little bit of a unique position.
It's so interesting. And I'm fascinated by that. How do your so you talked about being embraced, and you
Mm,
embraced Islam, and Islam has embraced you, which is
mm.
beautiful. And it'd be lovely to hear even more about, I'd like to hear that kind of some of the stereotypical myths broken. I think it's just perfect to have you in the studio talking to us. Um, how do people who physically present like you respond to you being a Muslim?
It's interesting. I think it's very situation specific. I think there are people, I think I've realized that the circles you move in very much dictate the kind of people you know. And usually you naturally gravitate to people who have aligned values and principles.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
people at the BBC are actually, I can't remember ever having a negative reaction.
So good.
Similar people in sport, you look at football, 10 to 12 million people play football. So there's a whole range of every part of society. But I would naturally gravitate to people who have had experience of diversity and who have mixed with people of different faiths and races. So actually, it's more people going out of their way to include me. During Ramadan, people will always be really apologetic about the fact that they're eating, and and I say, don't worry about it. If I told you not to eat, you'd probably be really offended. So that you're eating, I'm not. What's the
That's
difference?
wicked.
Yeah, I think I've been very, very lucky in my life experience. I've just been around lots of really nice people. I haven't, and I think I'm quite conscious that I've spoke to, especially I remember in my time at Kick It Out when I would deal with complaints of grassroots discrimination, and I'd meet people who had a really hard time just trying to play football, I'm very conscious that I have had very privileged life, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the key is that you understand and you reflect. You might, if you're from a privileged background, it's not my fault that most people would like a relatively stress-free life. I think the fact that when you're privileged or when you're not is the key. If everyone can reflect and understand what's happening, then most people would try and create a society where everyone has a more inclusive experience.
It's wonderful. Tell me about your children. You have mixed race children. I'm intrigued by having being mixed race myself. I
Mm.
find that I'm always intrigued by the mixed race experience, particularly now. It feels different to when I was a child. But what is it like to be the white father of mixed race
Yeah, it's
children?
very interesting because they look like white kids.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, very much so. They look like white kids who are slightly Mediterranean. So they've probably picked up more of my color than their mothers. And it's interesting because they're perceived as white, generally speaking, apart from people who know them. Um, actually, it's quite confusing for us about how we educate them. So we've been very conscious to reinforce their understanding of who they are, where they've come from, their history and heritage, but at the same time allow them just to be themselves. Some children will think about their ethnicity and be more reflective of it. Some people will go through life not thinking about it at all, and either approach is fine because it's their life. So I think we're trying to equip them for life by ensuring they understand where they're from, and that it's just what it is, and it's not a good or a bad thing. That's just who you are, and then it's up to them to sort of then go and live their lives. I think if they were visibly mixed heritage, then they'd be perceived differently. They'd probably have different experience, and that would feed into their understanding and their thoughts about it. Whether positive or negative. Um, yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you so much for just sharing those insights about your family, because that's powerful. And it's for me listening to that. I feel so, I don't know, I feel very hopeful about that. As a child in my generation and being a mixed race child, nobody knew what to do with mixed race children. We just warehouse us all in care homes, in children's homes. This is what happened to us. But to see this is just so exciting, and
Yeah.
to let the children just find out where they
Well,
want to
you
be.
know what's really, I find, I mean, obviously I don't have that experience, and I wouldn't tell anyone what to think or what not to think. But I think one way I look at it is, especially of our generation, it's quite a unique point in time, because over time the world is more global, more people can travel more, and everyone at some point will be a mix. There won't be any sort of
That's
one
exactly right.
ethnicity
That's right.
or cultural heritage. So I think, especially if you look at this generation, whether it's white and black or white and Asian, it's almost a unique sort of golden era of young people whose parents are from two different countries, two different cultures and heritages. And I think what I've found from people I've spoken to is they almost living dual life. They're living within two cultures. Often, they're one of their parents' cultures at home, and then a more, I guess, living an image or a perception of a lifestyle which is more white English outside. And I think that often happens with a lot of rich Asians. They would live an Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi cultural life at home, but because they're born and grown up in school with majority white kids, a more English lifestyle outside the home. And I think it feels like a lot of those people will almost have a helicopter view where they can pick and choose the bits of each culture. They're more reflective. I think when you're born into a culture, you just accept that is normal. That's probably the right way, and that's the way it should always be. But I think when you live within two cultures, you can almost reflect and pick out the things that you like, you think are good, and the things that you're not so keen on, because you've got the different perspectives. And I'm not sure that generation will happen again. You may get with other waves of immigration. Later on you had a big Afghani community coming to London, massive Sri Lankan communities coming into London. As those communities go through the same process, you'll have the same sort of mixed heritage young people growing up, going through the same identity issues on one hand, but actually cultural reflection on the other. So it's a challenge and opportunity.
Really interesting. I was I was thinking as you were talking about not very long ago being in like a Chinese takeaway restaurant. We were just going to grab something, and my wife and I, and a lady came in with a mixed race child, and it was one of these, just take what you want buffet type things, and we were just doing our thing, and then the child started speaking to his mother in Polish, and I suddenly went, oh yes, it's a complete. It's like, oh right, yeah. And back to your football point, I look and I watch. If you think back to the Euros and you look Sweden, Italy, Germany, and you think all these, particularly biracial people everywhere, and you're just going, oh, this is very different. Something shifted. So it's interesting what that will look like. Let me go back, if I may, in the final part of our conversation, just to think about studios again, because you've done some amazing work at studios. I mean, we are just thrilled to work with you, but the work you've done is incredible, and you're pushing that further and further and further. The dialogues you've been doing recently have been really exciting. What are your hopes for you're now the head of DNI there? What's your hopes?
I think that's an interesting conversation. I think going back to my point about what success looks like, because the goalposts keep moving. Obviously we have targets. Everyone has diversity targets, but I think again, re-emphasizing that point, diversity is no good without inclusion.
So important. Yeah.
So one analogy I give is, if, say, your ethnic diversity target was 20% to roughly reflect the wider population, and you're at 10%. If you achieve that 20%, but you don't achieve a sense of inclusion or belonging, all you've done is you've doubled the amount of unhappy people in the room. So actually, you've sort of gone backwards if you don't work on both at the same time. So I think targets are great. You do need to reflect, especially the BBC is the national broadcaster. You know, we're owned by the nation. We need to reflect the people that watch us, the people we serve. So it makes sense to have ambitions or inspirational targets that we don't follow to the letter, because I think sometimes when you look at targets too granularly, it can lead to the wrong behaviours, it can lead to tokenism, and that doesn't really work for anyone. You want to generally make sure the way you recruit people and the way you hire people is inclusive. So you're casting the net across all communities, because there's talent and skills and lived experience and knowledge in all communities. But I think we really want to work on that inclusion piece. We really want everyone in the building, from minorities and majorities, and wherever you are in that lasagna of privilege, everyone to feel like, you know, coming into work is a safe space. Where whatever's happening at home or whatever's happening in the world, you know, people are going to be bothered by political issues and wars that are happening around the world and the climate crisis. They feel like they can come into work and it's a safe space. They have friends they can talk to. They're not going to be excluded or discriminated against because of anything about them. The only thing that matters is the work they do, if they do good work, and if they do, that they're recognised and they can move on. And again, their identity isn't a barrier to being rewarded for merit.
Powerful. I think that really needs to be highlighted for people, because there is a real issue with metrics around. There's an issue there. And I think for me, what I see across the organisations, and we work globally with all sorts of different firms, all sorts of different sectors, when we meet organisations, we often meet organisations that are trying to practice what we would call diversity management. And that's not a thing, right, to start with. But the problem is, and I agree with you, it's about having representation. Representation is really important. But representation, to your point about 20% more unhappy workers, the reason why you have 20% more unhappy workers is you get representation, but at the cost of representation.
Yeah.
So what happens is, now you can say 20% of my workforce are black on the outside, but they have to behave like they were white on the inside in order to fit in this organization. Or I have to behave like I'm straight when I'm not, or I have to behave like I'm a male when I'm not. Yeah, and so it goes on. So I think the issue is about saying, can you make that pivot from saying, we don't just want representation, we want representation without the need to represent. So in other words, we want people to be able to show up and fit together and not have to try and fit in and not have to be inauthentic, right?
I think the bigger picture is direction of travel.
Yeah.
No organisation is completely inclusive or completely representative. No organisation is. Everyone's on this journey. And are you going in the right direction? Are you improving your representation? Are you more diverse? Because everyone can be.
Sure.
And are people feeling more included? So I think sometimes people are measuring the wrong things, or they're measuring in a really simplistic way. Good. So as an example, you might look at, in the UK, you've got this term BAME, which is not helpful. It's anyone who's non-white, 150 different backgrounds. Could a company be more nuanced and more evidence-based and break that down? Because we have the census, we ask people really complex questions around their ethnic identity. Could you break that down to see how you're really representative? Could you have a staff survey which asks a lot more questions about how they feel, whether they feel like they belong, whether they feel like there's barriers? So around whether it's ethnicity or gender, could you have a load of data points which gives you a really nuanced, insightful understanding of where you really are on that journey? Because if you just say we're 60% male and 40% female, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to the people in your organization.
Doesn't mean anything.
Whereas if you have that really nuanced, broad data pack where you can draw out insight, you can be evidence-based, so you're more likely to be successful, but it gives you a feeling and a narrative and a story. You know, it's a human story, which is what this is all about.
No, it's great. One of the things that our listeners and viewers are always keen on is things that can kind of bridge the knowing doing gap, right? What would you say are maybe one or two things that people can do to kind of nurture this sense of inclusion? I think we've got you absolutely on the diversity point. We make that's clear, and your point about how it's without inclusion it doesn't go anywhere. So I would say that if you sow the seeds of inclusion into your organization, nurture them, water them, tend to them, then you will harvest all of the benefits of diversity. But what are some of the maybe a couple of farming tips for how you might be able to seed
you're
inclusion?
right that if you get diversity right, doesn't mean people will be included. If you get inclusion right, it will lead to diversity.
That must be right.
Yeah, people will tell people that they like working at a place, and they'll also tell people they don't. And in a world which is more globally connected, news travels fast. I would say just really, really simple in a nutshell: connect and speak to people more. You've got people do staff surveys. They can be better. People have staff networks, but often, even though you have a voice of different communities, people don't tap into it and don't ask them things. You know, if at BBC Studios we're making a documentary on Pride Month and we have a Pride staff network, why would we not talk to that network as a sounding board?
Yeah, sure.
You know, that network won't decide what happens in the programme. They're not producers or executives or directors, but a sounding board, because they're ultimately some of the consumers that are going to be watching those programmes. So I would say there are loads of touch points within the organisation. Everyone does a really common, what I think is a mistake, is people don't do enough you said, we dids.
Yeah.
You know, you ask people in the staff survey their opinions, you take it away and you talk about it in a dark room. Whereas if you go out, if the chief exec goes out to those people and says, you told us this and we've done this. Firstly, people are more likely to give you honest opinions. And secondly, they'll feel like they've been listened to. That in itself is inclusion. You know, inclusion is about everybody. As I say, inclusion is for everyone. It's not just for minority groups. The more everyone feels included, you'll naturally be breaking down those barriers between groups.
Really nice. So if I hear you right, inclusion fundamentally is about being seen, being met, and being heard. Maybe that's it. Well, I tell you what, I'm just reminded as we finish of I don't know if you remember a TV show called Cheers. You remember that show? It had a lovely signature tune, if you remember it. And the signature tune, one of the lines in it was, wouldn't you like to go to a place where everybody knows your name and they're glad you came? And maybe that's an inclusive culture, right?
Yeah.
Where everybody knows your name and they're glad you came. Well, we know your name, and so does everybody else now, Kevin Yusuf Coleman, and I'm very glad you came. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.